Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Erin Kopek, and I am with Higher Level. You have joined our High Notes program for today, and we're super excited to work with Ted McKinney on this morning's High Notes, talking about psychological safety, employee trust, and how to improve that with your organization. Before we begin, this call will last less than an hour. You are currently set up in listen-only mode. You absolutely have the ability to ask questions and type that into your chat function at the bottom of your GoToWebinar toolbar. So feel free to do that throughout the presentation if you have anything that you want to check in with Ted on. We also will be sending out the recording after the presentation, so you'll be able to view that at your own leisure and share that as well. Before we get started, I want to introduce Ted and kind of give you a little bit information about his background. So Ted McKinney, he is a senior leadership consultant with Beatty in Clayton, Missouri. Beatty is a highly experienced management consulting firm that focuses on leadership development and C-suite services. Ted brings with him decades of operations experience from his time working in the logistics and veterinary industries. His passion is helping leaders who wish to create environments where the employees and the organization flourish. His extensive research into psychological safety enables him to give leaders the tools to meet employees where they're at and align everyone around a common goal. His approach helps everyone understand the relationship between leadership, work climate, and organizational efficiency. I'm definitely looking forward to having some great takeaways this morning. And Ted, I pass it over to you.
Great. Can everybody see my screen okay? We're going to talk today and hopefully try to make sense of leadership. This presentation is based on my doctoral research where I looked at psychological safety and servant leader behaviors and what that relationship was. But it's really an extension of that. I spent 20 years working in logistics and distribution, and a common thread across my career was the environments all had a toxic nature. And I think I understand that a lot better from the standpoint of leader behavior now, but this presentation will look at what we can do to mitigate that and how we can change our work cultures and climates. So our agenda today is we're going to talk briefly about what leadership is. We'll talk about communication. We'll talk about how employees make sense of that communication. At a high level, we'll talk about psychological safety. And I'm going to introduce this model that's really based on my research and the antecedent conditions required for psychological safety to emerge. If I do a good job today, these are the takeaways you'll see, or you'll get how to build resilient teams that can thrive in today's VUCA world. And if you're not familiar with the acronym VUCA, it stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And it was a term coined by the United States Army War College after the Cold War to describe the climate that they were functioning in. And it began to show up in the leadership literature in the 1990s. So we'll talk about the VUCA world and teams. We'll talk about some specific do's and don'ts of leader behavior for creating a healthy work climate. We'll try to understand communication and why it's so hard, how we can do it better. And then we'll explore that model a little bit. So what is leadership? Leadership has evolved over the last 100 years. In 1927, this was a definition of leadership from a leadership conference: the ability to impress the will of the leader on those led and induce obedience, respect, loyalty, and cooperation. Today, leadership is best defined by Peter Northouse, and he says that it's a process whereby an individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. But because of that VUCA world we live in, a lot of what happens today is done at the team level. So leadership's also about building and maintaining high-performing teams, and oftentimes that's how we evaluate performance at the team level. So if that's what leadership is, what do people want in their leader? A recent study found that there's not really a consensus for what people think makes a good leader. Now, this was done with college students, 500 plus college students, so take it with a grain of salt. But 38% of the participants identified what the researchers called as a prototypical leader. About a third endorsed the idea of a disengaged or passive laissez-faire leader. 20% endorsed the idea of an autocratic or a narcissistic pushy type leader. And the head scratcher for me is that there's a percentage of people out there that endorse this tyrannical type leader. So as leaders, we face the ever-changing, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment. And we face the challenge that our reports might all need something different from us or have different expectations of what they want from their leader. Too often, this is what leadership can feel like under those circumstances. Today, we're going to talk about how we wield those sticks and carrots and the impact of that, how we influence people with our behaviors. What we need to remember is that we're always on stage. Our words and deeds are constantly being scrutinized. Are they in harmony? I love this quote from Mr. Stokes that if your actions don't live up to your words, you have nothing to say. And I think the reason that that's important is that Larry Sin was one of the original work culture consultants, and he talks about this phenomenon of organizations becoming shadows of their leader. So for better or worse, people at the top of an organization are the ones that have the greatest influence on the culture and performance of their company. Our direct reports and the people in our organization tend to absorb leaders' values and they mirror their behaviors. So we have this leadership dilemma. We have leadership being the idea of influence, and we're going to do that through communication and sense making. And how do we craft a message that crosses this void and retains its original intent? This quote really changed my philosophy and my paradigm as it relates to what it means to be a leader and how to communicate. Language lies on the border between oneself and the other. The word in language is half someone else's. What that means to me is that it doesn't matter what I say or what I do. It doesn't matter what comes out of that bullhorn. It only matters how people interpret those facts. And that's a challenge. And it's a challenge because nobody joins our organization as a blank slate. We all are brought up differently. We have our own fears and biases. As we talked about, we have our own expectations of what it means to be led. You combine that with the group experiences that happen in an organization. We all experience the same broken processes, bad communication. We share stories and rumors about the organization. And what that really is, it's this process of sense making. It's how we structure the unknown. What are we doing to make sense of our experiences and the situations we encounter in an organization? It's a process where individuals develop mental maps of their environment. Think of a kid touching a stove. They only touch that hot stove once. And that's what employees go through in the sense-making process. It's also this collaborative idea that we're developing shared meaning and kind of a group level awareness of what's happening. That's the work climate coming out. So let me give you two quick examples of sense making. The first one is a personal example. About 4.5, 5 years ago, my father had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and his health was deteriorating. I joined this PhD program and was in a mental state one morning that I probably wasn't fully engaged. I walked in to work and went to my office, and a few minutes later, our sweet little cleaning lady came in and handed me a doctor's note. And I said, Liz, I appreciate it, but the doctor's notes go to HR. And Liz said, I know that, but I thought you were mad at me. Somehow Liz had interpreted my behavior, my isolation, and my lack of acknowledging her, which was my standard practice to say good morning every day, as a reflection of something she'd done the previous day. The two were not related, but she made sense of it, that they were somehow tied together. My omission of a good morning and her attendance didn't make sense. And a second example looks at a similar experience, but it really brings in this idea of culture and aggregation. A veterinary consultant shared with me that he was in a clinic one morning and he had gotten there early to see how the day got off before the clients arrived. And about 15 minutes before the first appointment, a receptionist walked through holding a sign that looks a lot like this slide. And he thought that was odd, but he let it pass. And the next morning, the process repeated itself, but there was a smiley face on the card that the receptionist had walked through with. So he finally inquired and understood what was going on, but he was certain that the owner didn't, the owner of the veterinary clinic. It was a single doctor practice, and the veterinarian had a history of being a little volatile. So when he asked him about these two mornings in question, he learned that on the first morning, the doctor had pulled into the parking spot, attempting to multitask on his phone, and hit the curb too hard and spilled a cup of coffee in his lap. He raced in and changed into his scrubs and saw patients the rest of the day in his surgery scrubs. Come to find out, this was a pattern or a process that the team had developed as a defense mechanism or as a security mechanism to kind of let everybody know what the day was going to look like. And they were making sense of the leader showing up, spilling coffee on himself, as it was going to be a long day because he was in a bad mood. So hopefully with those two illustrations, you can see the power of sense making and the impact that intentional and unintentional leader behaviors can have on the work climate. Adam Galinsky, who's a professor at Columbia University, wrote an article in the New York Times, and it's titled, "When You're in Charge, Your Whisper May Feel Like a Shout." And the article really looks at communication and how it's amplified by power. He talks about three types of communication that are really affected: direct communication, ambiguity, and silence. So we saw two examples of where silence has an impact, but let me give you an example of the other two. Imagine a scenario where you pass through the break room at lunch and you see somebody that you need to talk to. And you say, "Hey, Gina, make sure you stop by and see me today about 4 before you go home. I have something we need to talk about." That's a fairly benign conversation, but the ambiguity for the receiver can lead to catastrophizing. What have I done wrong? Am I in trouble? And so we really have to be cognizant of the message we're sending as it relates to communication and influence. So if we look at that from this idea of the leadership dilemma, how do we influence people? What does communication and sense making look like? Remember that if you're a leader, you're at a disadvantage because of your positional power and the perception that that might create in the follower's mind. There's a inherent distrust of people who have the ability to punish us or reward us. I think that's a long-standing, almost genetic function just from our evolution. And employees are likely to only speak up when the benefits outweigh the risk. So all these factors play into what happens in our organizations with sense making when we go to problem solve. So I'm sure everybody on this call at one point or another has asked the question, why isn't my employee, my team, or my organization more effective? We all face problems, and the symptoms are oftentimes obvious, but the causes sometimes are hidden. And based on my research, my personal experience, I'm biased and I believe the vast majority of the time, psychological safety is playing a role in our organizational problems. So let me give you an example of what we're talking about before we get into a definition of psychological safety. I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but when I was growing up, there was a movie called Big. And in the movie, a child was transformed into a man's body and somehow ended up working at a toy factory. And an article I read recently used this as an illustration of psychological safety. And I went back and watched the movie, and I think it's spot on. In this case, the meeting's adjourning and everybody's going around and talked about this new product and how it's just going to dominate the market. Kids are going to love it. And this child who's been transformed into a man here played by Tom Hanks raises his hand and he says, "I don't get it." Psychological safety is easy when you're a child. It's the idea of childhood innocence. As adults, we've developed all these defenses that we employ to ensure that we belong and we're accepted by our team and our peers. And from the standpoint of a leader and why it's important to promote psychological safety, I love this quote from Napoleon that those who failed to oppose me, who readily agreed with me and accepted all of my views, were those who did me the most injury. So what's the alternative to creating psychological safety? Well, in the absence of psychological safety, you have someone who has something to contribute, but they worry about being vulnerable. They don't want to sound stupid. They want to make sure that their idea makes sense. And too often, before they get the courage to voice their opinion, the opportunity's passed. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but it can be. And this may seem hyperbolic. I'll give you two examples of where this was a big deal. In 1986, two catastrophes happened. The Space Shuttle Challenger exploded and the Chernobyl nuclear plant melted down. These two events had two things in common. Once, both of them had cultures of dangerous silence. There wasn't psychological safety. And both of these events were avoidable failures. In some cases, like the NASA challenge, it was a really hierarchical organization. People had identified that there was a problem, but they couldn't cut through the red tape and the politics to get the problem on the radar for people so they could prevent the disaster. In some cases, there's more of a political or cultural component that relates to power distance and prevents psychological safety and communication from happening. So when we talk about psychological safety, it's defined as a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for voicing ideas, raising concerns, questioning authority, or making an honest mistake. And from my point of view, psychological safety emerges when leaders balance their behavior such that when people make sense of what's happening, they feel safe. Part of why I believe this is that research consistently indicates that 4 out of 5 conflicts between people and organizations are due to this process. It's about the stories they've made up to each other, about the meaning that they've applied to what they've made sense of. So how do we do this better? Well, I think we have to have a communication feedback loop between the leaders and the followers. And trust and psychological safety are very similar constructs. In fact, oftentimes they're used synonymously. But trust really focuses on giving somebody else the benefit of the doubt. Psychological safety is your perception that somebody's going to extend that same courtesy to you. And this isn't just an academic or a theoretical construct. In 2016, Google published research from 5 years of study on what makes successful teams. They looked at 200 teams and defined the top 5 characteristics: psychological safety, dependability, structure and clarity, meaning, and impact. What I find interesting is that in the absence of psychological safety, the other 4 factors weren't effective. Psychological safety was foundational to team success. They looked at it from every angle. They tried to decide, did you need a certain number of introverts and extroverts? Did you need an MBA and did you need an accountant? The reality was team construction was irrelevant. It was about how the team interacted that drove team performance. So why is that performance driven by psychological safety? These are all outcomes that have been researched from psychological safety. How much time do we as leaders spend trying to create a climate of creativity, innovation, empowerment, engagement? Maybe it's as simple as creating the right culture. If that's the why do it, how does it happen? Well, Dr. Edmondson's research in a hospital environment was looking at high-performing teams and what makes the best performing teams from a nursing standpoint. And when the data came back, she was perplexed because the best performing teams were making the most mistakes. And that's counterintuitive. And then it dawned on her that the best performing teams weren't making the most mistakes. They were learning from those mistakes. So they had an environment that was safe enough to not sweep those mistakes under the rug. They were in a learning zone, and that's what psychological safety is all about. I think we've all experienced an absence of psychological safety with high accountability where we create anxiety. And in some cases, when leaders aren't doing their job and we don't have enough accountability, we end up in a comfort zone. And God forbid we find ourselves in an apathy zone, because I think that's the worst case scenario as a leader, is how to change that environment. What you're probably hearing is that a lot of what I'm talking about is relational. It's about a relationship between a leader and a follower. It's about a dyadic process. That's going to be difficult to do at Ford or Boeing or Anheuser-Busch. How do we scale psychological safety across an organization? And we have a tool at our disposal, even if it's not easy to change. The tools, the work climate and the work culture, 2 terms that are also used synonymously. There's a distinction in that the climate's really about what we perceive and the culture is really about what we believe. But these 2 things combine, and we're talking about the environment people are working in. And there's outcomes that can be expected, that engagement, all of those things that we looked at previously in a high psychologically safe environment. And without it, you don't have those benefits. I think when we think about culture, here's an example from the Harvard Business Review that culture takes over when the executives leave the room. And they talk about our discretionary behavior and how culture is what drives the behavior, and it picks up where the handbook leaves off. Employees are making decisions every day, and culture is their guide. I think of it a lot like taking my 3-year-old bowling. Culture is kind of the bumpers they put up to keep her out of the gutters in some cases. So the last point here in this article is that it really tells us whether we can risk telling our boss about ideas and problems or whether we sweep things under the rug. And that at its core is psychological safety. So psychological safety is an individual level construct that aggregates at the team level. And much of the research has been looked at from the team level. That's where the performance aspects come in. But when you have enough teams experiencing this, it can become an organizational trait. And that's where I talked about resilience and how you can build resilience despite being in a VUCA environment. So I'll share another illustration of what a mature organizational culture looks like. And I'm going to steal David Foster Wallace's introduction to his Kenyon College address. at graduation. He said there's two fish swimming along and they encounter an older fish. And the old guy says to him, "Boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a few minutes and they look at each other and one of them says, "What the hell is water?" I think that's the reality of what happens with organizations and cultures. It becomes so embedded in the fabric of what we do and experience every day that we lose sight of what's happening. I had an instructor share a story about a consulting engagement he was on in a company that did a lot of development, a design firm company. And he said he went in the first day and observed all morning. And at lunch, he sat down with the project sponsor. And he said, I'm struggling to see how you guys can be so effective. You know, there's a lot of toxic communication going on. This environment doesn't seem very healthy. And the project sponsor had a "what the hell is water" moment. As they unpacked what was going on, design firms have to do a lot of experimentation. Failure is part of the process. They had very intentionally created a culture and a climate where learning from failure was critical. They had a culture where the comment of "that's a bad idea" didn't threaten somebody's sense of belonging in the organization. So I think there's hope for us if we make a very intentional effort to create psychological safety. And if you're still not convinced and you still think this is a warm and fuzzy construct and you need some bottom line numbers to help motivate you, this was a recent article from HBR that proof that positive work cultures are more productive. In organizations where there's high pressure, the expenses on healthcare are nearly 50% greater than in other organizations. The American Psychological Association estimates that more than $500 billion is lost from the US economy because of workplace stress. And due to this type of stress on the job, nearly 550 million workdays are lost each year. So there's more benefits than just the warm fuzzy. There's tangible bottom line benefits to creating a healthy work culture. Let's stop here and just do a quick check-in. We've talked about what leadership is, communication, sense making, and psychological safety at a high level. Are there any questions about those 4 ideas before we explore the model a little? Aaron, has anybody submitted anything to the chat?
Hi, I do not see any questions, but if anyone would like to type in a question at their chat box, we can relay that to Ted.
Well, hold them to the end then. We'll touch on questions again in a few minutes. As we start into the model, I want you to think about a comment I heard Dr. Edmondson make in a presentation she did, that a question is really a sign of respect. So if leadership is about influence and psychological safety is about balancing power and empathy and creating a learning climate, I think that's the starting point. And empathy is critical. As Elizabeth Thomas says, empathy is the only human superpower. It can shrink distance, cut through social and power hierarchies, transcend differences, and provoke political and social change. That's what the employees are experiencing. That's what they're making sense of, is how you're engaging with them. So that's what fosters psychological safety. But the model then is about developing and maintaining it. So if it's grounded in my research on leader behavior, and a lot of what's on here are the antecedent conditions required for it to emerge, keep in mind, this can't be all encompassing, but the vast majority of the pinch points organizations experience are going to fall somewhere on this model. So I think we have to start, if organizations become a shadow of their leader, in the bottom left with ethical leadership. Any attempt to build a psychologically safe culture has to begin there. Additionally, leaders have to be candid and hold people accountable. Consistency and equitable treatment are what people are watching for from their leaders. Too often, timid leaders fail to have these difficult conversations and sidestep these challenges. And this lack of accountability not only prevents the person who's struggling from course correcting, but it also creates a sense of injustice with the rest of the team. Additionally, as our words and deeds are scrutinized, like we talked about, we have to be cognizant of what we're saying and how we're performing. But if we act ethically, we get the accountability piece right, and we're aware of our actions and our words, we have the chance of developing trustworthiness and having our employees give us the benefit of the doubt. And when we do that, we can enter into a relationship with them. And leadership is a process that happens in people interactions. It's not a trait of the person in charge. Leaders garner their influence through this process of building and nurturing relationships. But that's only about half the battle. Additionally, employees are making sense of what's going on organizationally. They're looking at, are their contributions valued? Do they feel supported? Do they have the tools they need to be effective in their jobs? Are they compensated fairly? Is their work environment safe? All of these things are part of the climate that promotes psychological safety. But if you get those right, you can get to the place where you start talking about values alignment. And this is where you can get some traction. When people's values are aligned with their organizations and they're intertwined, it drives empowerment, engagement, feelings of purpose. Ultimately, those shared values boost performance. It's why Simon Sinek talks so much about make sure you explain the why. And the last and most important step potentially is inclusion. I have a colleague and good friend from the PhD program named Dr. Salwa Rahim Dillard, and she does a lot of work in the D&I space. And she defines inclusion as the perception and feeling of belonging and being valued for the full authentic expression of your culture and yourself. So we need to create these environments where people can show up and they don't feel the need to wear a mask. They don't need to code switch based on who's in the room. They can show up and be their authentic self. And when you do that, it's inspiring and it's engaging, and psychological safety can emerge. But there's a caveat. Dr. Edmondson suggests that it takes time to build, and it happens based on familiarity and positive responses to vulnerability, other interpersonally risky actions. But it can be destroyed in an instant when a leader responds negatively to an act of vulnerability. So the one thing I didn't talk about on the model is the idea of courage. It takes courage for that person to raise their hand and ask that question, to question a policy or procedure, question authority. It also takes courage for a leader to respond appropriately to that vulnerability. You have to be strategically aware, and sometimes it means swallowing your pride when you get those questions. So this is some more of Dr. Edmondson's research. This is where I want to talk about how we respond. It's a spectrum of reasons for failure. Failure happens for a number of reasons. It can be somebody being deviant, but also, like we talked about with the design firm, there's hypothesis testing and exploration. When she talked to a group of executives about failure and asked them what happened in their organizations, they said 2 to 5% of the time the failures are truly blameworthy. However, the same executives estimated that 70 to 90% of the time, that's how they treated them, was as blameworthy events. So when I was managing a 12-doctor veterinary hospital that was a daytime general practice as well as an emergency clinic, Whose fault was it if we rushed an employee to the floor because there's a staffing shortage? Or whose fault was it if we had 8 emergencies show up in an hour and we couldn't control the spigot and we overwhelmed our staff? I think that's what we're talking about, is how do we respond to failures? Are we intentionally trying to understand them and learn from them? Or are we making assumptions and moving forward? So accountability is obviously something we spend a lot of time on, but I want to revisit the idea of how leaders duck having these conversations sometimes. A lot of times it's done in the name of harmony. Jeff Hayden published an article in Inc. magazine several months ago, and I love this idea that the things you encourage may frame your culture, but the things you permit truly define your culture. We have to be willing to be vulnerable ourselves and have those hard conversations. He suggests that you take a hard look at the behaviors and values that you encourage, but take an even harder look at the behaviors and values you permit. So organizationally, how do we actualize this? How do we put this into action? Dr. Edmondson's research is recently published in her book, The Fearless Organization. And she says there's 3 steps. The first step is setting the stage. The second step is inviting participation. And the third step is responding productively. When we talk about setting the stage, we're talking about creating shared meaning, expectations, and understanding. We need to minimize the need for sense making with clear, concise communication. We need to front load accountability with unambiguous expectation setting. We have to explain the why until people understand what's at stake and for whom. And then we can frame failure as a learning opportunity. When we invite participation, this is all about encouraging others' opinions and being open to discussion. If you are too busy or perceived to be too busy, nobody's going to come see you. You have to be accessible if people are going to speak up. We have to listen intently when employees feel like you may actually take some action on their concerns. It promotes feedback. If you have an open door policy and nothing ever happens when people walk through that door, you might as well close it. We have to create structures and processes to support communication. This might be an anonymous Dropbox, or it might be a protocol that everybody on a call has to speak, some way to get everybody engaged in the process and promote communication. And this is a taboo topic for some leaders, but it's okay to demonstrate humility and acknowledge that you don't have all the answers. It creates a sense of engagement to somebody when you reach out to them for help. So that's how we invite participation. How do we respond productively? To me, this is the key takeaway. We have to have strategic awareness and the courage to be empathetic. We have to encourage and celebrate acts of vulnerability. We have to be on the lookout and make sure when people raise their hand, they're acknowledged. Express appreciation for their contributions. Before we react, we have to ask, are these failures blameworthy or are they praiseworthy? Can we learn from this, or is this something that's truly deviant? We have to embrace a culture of candor and continuous learning. You have to sanction violations that are clear. And remember that conflict isn't always a zero-sum game. If you go into a conversation with your mind made up, no one's going to learn from that. So in conclusion, as I wrap up, I want to take us to 2 resources that can help if you're looking to create psychological safety. BeattyLeadership.com, where I work, has a series of blogs and other content that can be beneficial. And Dr. Edmondson's book, The Fearless Organization, has a website that also is a complement to it. And at that website, you can take what's known as the Fearless Organization Scan. And it'll give you a report that will look at your work environment from the standpoint of these 4 domains: inclusion and diversity. How willing to help are the people in your organization? Are they open to conversations? And what is their attitude toward risk and failure? And that can be valuable information, not just from an assessment point of view to see how your culture compares to others, but more importantly for opening the door for conversation. It'll give you a tool for having those difficult discussions about what's inhibiting psychological safety. Several people have been certified Fearless Organization consultants. I happen to be one of them, so feel free to reach out if there's things that Ted McKinney or Beatty can do to support what your organization is trying to accomplish. With that, Aaron, I think we should see if there's any additional questions.
All right, thank you so much, Ted. Thank you for everyone for attending today. We will take the next minute or so to give you a chance to ask any ongoing questions or any last minute topics that you want Ted to review. We do have a few minutes for questions, so feel free to type that in your question box on the bottom of your GoToWebinar panel, and we'll give you a couple minutes for that. Thank you, Ted, today. There was definitely some great takeaways. I have a lot of action items, really good reminders, so appreciate your participation.
Sure. Thanks for hosting.
We'll give another minute. And just so everybody knows on the call, our program is SHRM accredited, so we'll be sending out the recording and also the activity ID to receive your SHRM education credits. And we have a couple of great events coming up, Higher Level does over the next month or so. So at the end of July 27th, we actually have a national hiring event that we are hosting for some of our clients. So if you know someone looking for a career opportunity, send them our way. We have a lot of job opportunities, both in our local offices and also on a national level. We also are hosting our High Notes program coming up in August. And the topic is going to be talking about the economic and the workforce significance for childcare and really what that means for the employer during last year and the pandemic and moving forward and kind of what we learned. So great topics and resources coming up. You can reach me at hello@higherlevel.com if you want to access any of this information or make sure you're on our mailing list and make sure you're in the know, and I would be happy to help you. So Ted, you're getting shout outs, great seminar, excellent thought-provoking presentation, but no questions coming in. So you must have covered it and gave us all some great reminders to kind of go back and work with our teams on.
Okay.
All right, everyone. Well, that wraps up our presentation. I appreciate it again, and thank you for spending your morning with Higher Level, and have a great rest of your day.